Bonsoir, c'est la suite.
Good evening. We're here for another session of the Bibliotopia Festival online. Thank you for attending. I'm very touched and happy to be here with Philippe Sands and Bikont. Welcome. It's very moving to read your work. I think it's very important work, necessary work, and very accessible to the readers, thanks to the long and arduous investigative work you have done to bring these two books to us. We're going to be talking about these two books today. We have great respect for the years you spent writing these books, and we thank you for being here today to share your work with us. Bikont, you're the co-founder of the Polish daily Gazeta Wyborcza. So you are a journalist, but you're also the author of about 10 nonfiction books. Only one of them has been translated into French so far, I believe, but what a book it is. Le Crime et le Silence. It was published in Poland in 2004 and in 2011 in French at De Noël. You won the European Book Prize the same year for that book. This book is the account of the massacre on the 10th of July, 1941, after a long investigation that you carried out, the massacre of the Jewish inhabitants of the village by the Polish inhabitants. During this session, you will be explaining the context underlying this program, but you'll also be helping us to understand how this collective crime is at the heart of the work of remembrance and the efforts that Poland has made to face up to facts after the war and today. So remembrance, guilt, and the denial of guilt are also central to The Rat Line, Philippe Sands, which was published this autumn by Albin Michel. Philippe Sands, you are a barrister, a law professor, and a specialist in international law. I've probably forgotten some of your hats that you wear. You have published about 15 books, but The Rat Line stands out. But to explain why, I will have to come back to East-West Street, which was published in 2017. Limburg was the birthplace of your grandfather, Leon, the only survivor of family decimated by the Holocaust. And it was there in the Ukraine that you began your investigation, which led to The Rat Line and to your piecing together the lives of Charlotte and her husband, Otto von Wechter, a very important player in the Third Reich and in the Hitlerian regime. It's difficult when one reads these books to believe that all of this is true, but they are both works of nonfiction. And The Rat Line also led to a documentary, My Nazi Legacy, which will be available on the Bibliotopia website this evening until Monday evening. Before we get into the substance of what your two books recount, I'd like to take advantage of the fact that you were in Nuremberg on Friday evening, the 20th of November, for the commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the beginning of the Nuremberg trials. Perhaps you could just say a few words about the very special day that you had in Nuremberg.
Yes, certainly. I would like to say how. Yes, certainly. I would like to say how pleased I am to be back here. It's the second time I have the opportunity of being in this wonderful place. 2 days ago, I was in Nuremberg. On the 20th of November 1945, started the landmark Nuremberg trials. It was, therefore, the 75th anniversary of the day on Friday. A commemoration took place in the presence of the President of the German Republic, Mr. Steinmeier. There were only 4 or 5 participants because of COVID. I did what I could to be there, which means I am sentenced to a fortnight of lockdown the minute I get back to England. We were meeting in courtroom 600, an astonishing place because all roads lead to Nuremberg. Without the 20th of November 1945, we wouldn't have had major trials concerning Yugoslavia, Rwanda, the International Criminal Court, the arrest of Pinochet, and very recently also the Gambian case, the case concerning the Rohingyas and Myanmar. I was there in the presence of Aung San Suu Kyi, Nobel Peace Prize, who had come to defend the interest of her country against accusations of genocide. Without the Nuremberg trials, all that would not have been possible. Of course, this is important in the field of politics, policy, law, but it was also a very personal moment for me. In the presence of the President of the Republic of Germany, I put the question of wondering what would have happened if I had been in Vienna with my 2 grandmothers, where at a few minutes before they were going to be deported to Theresienstadt, for example, whether they could imagine that their grandson was one day going to attend a commemoration such as the one of the 75th anniversary. Yes, very briefly, in Lemberg there were 2 lawyers who developed the concept of genocide. How did that concept develop? And Anna, this is a question to you as well. Between the very first writings and our idea we have now of that concept today, how did things develop? Well, a revolutionary moment was mentioned during the commemoration. It was the very first time that those 2 terms, crime against humanity, which talks about individuals, and the concept of genocide, which talks about groups, were expressed in the course of a trial. 2 individuals are at the source of these 2 concepts. 2 individuals who come from Lemberg, who studied at the university in Lemberg, Herr Schlauterbach, who is the person who developed the concept of crimes against humanity, and Mr. Lemkin, who was not there in Nuremberg in 45. But we would very much like to find a picture of his presence in courtroom 600, but it doesn't exist. He wasn't there. Since 1945, these 2 concepts have found it difficult to survive, as it were. For 50 years, nothing happened. At the beginning of the 90s, with atrocities in Rwanda and ex-Yugoslavia, the 2 concepts were looked at again. 2 international tribunals were set up, and after that, the International Criminal Court was created, was founded, the ICC.
Thank you. Anna Bikont, what would you call what happened in Jedwabne in legal terms, and how, was reparation granted and was reparation carried out, since we're talking about this topic? Well, I would have to refer this back to Philippe. I'm not competent to talk about the legal aspects, but there was a trial. There were many trials in Poland after the war. trials for collaboration with the Germans. But the implication was that the Poles hadn't done anything, that they were just collaborating with the Germans, and sometimes they needed to be punished for this. The trial at Jedwabne was different. The Germans were actors in the massacre, but they weren't in a broad sense of the term, but they weren't there. 22 people were tried in Wabney, and 13 of them were sentenced to 10 years in prison or even more in some cases. But what was interesting about the trial was that the Poles who had killed their Jewish neighbors on the 10th of July, 1941, by throwing them into a barn and burning them alive. What was interesting was that even though we were in the communist era and people were in general afraid, a lot of letters came in from citizens of Jedwabne who said, these people are good citizens. We know that they are decent people who fought the Germans. There was great support for the murderers during the trial. And 60 years later, when Jan Gross, who really got the discussion going with his book Neighbors, described what had taken place. And since this festival is on the theme of the family this year, what I found interesting was that the family was a sort of place of solidarity with the murderers. So the whole city was in denial. The Jews were killed, but we don't know by whom. And it was the grandchildren of those who had taken part. So we see that the family lineage has kept to the official version. Can you help us understand how these incidents, your book and Jan Gross, shook Poland up and shocked the readers? To what extent did the pogrom in Jedwabne have an effect on the country? Well, that was very interesting, because Jan Gross's book is about 100 pages where he talks about a small village that nobody had heard of there before in northeastern Poland. People knew about Auschwitz by that time, obviously. But when Jan Gross wrote his book, it was a huge national discussion that was triggered. Why was it this book that triggered it? Why were we talking about the Polish neighbors? Well, because the relationships that Poland has had have often been difficult. For example, its relationship with the Ukraine. And it was then that we started to realize that this was not by chance, and that the real problem that Poland has, and which was revealed, was what happened during the Holocaust in Poland, because the Holocaust actually unfolded in Poland. Although, of course, the perpetrators were the Germans, but it happened on Polish territory. And Jewish blood flows over the Polish land. And Jan Gross's book was the first of a series of books where we learned more and more. Because at the beginning, it was just one incident in a small village. And we thought, this is strange that it happened in this one little village. But now we know that it wasn't an isolated incident, and there are no villages, virtually no villages in Poland where the Jews were not killed by the Poles. So there was an enormous body of research that had to be carried out to find out what happened during the war. It was obvious during the war, and immediately afterwards was completely erased from the national memory. You often say, or I've read that you say that Poland was sick and had been made ill by its history. And I think it's interesting to see how so many years later we continue to learn new information and to read new documents that you have brought to light and that you allow to speak for themselves. Before we get into your books, I'd like to ask both of you how these stories entered into your lives. For me, it was by chance. Jan Gross's book was published. I was a reporter at Gazeta, and it seemed obvious to me that somebody had to go out to this little town and have a look around and try to find out what had happened in a town where for 60 years there had been memories, but nobody ever talked about them aloud. All the European and American television crews were there. They were on the market square in Jedwabne. So what happens when all of a sudden you have to face a truth that you've covered up for 60 years? It seemed obvious to me that we had to go and take a look as well. And when the director of my newspaper, the editor-in-chief, said, no, we can't do this, I was obviously very upset. I mean, it was my newspaper, after all. So I took a holiday, a long holiday, a sabbatical, and I worked on it for 4 years.
Merci beaucoup.
And you wrote a magnificent book, which was a source of inspiration for me. Your meeting with all these people, all these characters, one couldn't really invent, leads us to say that it's amazing that this story wasn't told earlier on. You mean Anna's story or my story? Well, if you're talking about my story, says Philippe Sands, it was also by chance. In 2011, I met Nicholas Frank, Hans Frank's son. The first thing he told me when I met him in Hamburg was, I'm against the death penalty in all cases except in the case of my father. That was quite a striking statement. He's a man who hates his father. He wrote a book about it, by the way. Nicholas said very kindly, Philip, your grandfather comes from Lemberg, Lviv, Lemberg, whatever you call it. Would it be interesting for you to meet the son of the former governor of Galicia, who was based in Lemberg, Otto Wächter? I said, yes, why not? But why would he want to meet me? But I'd be open to meeting him. So 6 weeks later, Nicholas and I traveled out to a small Austrian village, Hagenberg, where Horst von Wächter, someone I now know very well, welcomed us very nicely. He's an adorable man, very kind. He's not an anti-Semite. He doesn't deny the Holocaust. He doesn't even deny the fact that his father was involved. But what he does deny is that his father was a criminal. His father, who was accused of crimes against humanity in 1945, responsible of the death of 100,000 Jews and more. I wrote an article about him for the Financial Times in 2013, which aroused a great deal of interest, talking about the governor of Krakow until 1942, and then he went to Lemberg as governor. The film had considerable echo. David Evans, a university friend of mine, said, well, this would make a very good documentary. I was somewhat skeptical, but we worked on this with Nicholas first in Bavaria, then we went to see Horst, and finally the BBC shot the film, which got a number of awards. It was very interesting. I was working with Nicholas and Horst, two sons. One adores his father, the other hates his father. You can't invent a story like this. I wouldn't say I was between the two sons, because these are the sons of two men who exterminated my Jewish family. So all this to show that the whole story is quite a personal story. With Horst, it's always the same thing. We make contact. He read the article in the Financial Times, and he said, oh, this is atrocious. But 6 weeks later, he's back and he wants to talk some more. The film, he hated it, What Our Fathers Did. And he said, that's not the title. It should be What Our Fathers Did and Didn't Do. He's got something of a sense of humor. So he walked away. But then he comes back several months later and he says, let's carry on our conversation. In the film, at a given point, Nicholas says that Horst is a neo-Nazi. And Horst was furious about this. You can say lots of things about Horst von Wächter, but he is certainly not a Nazi. He therefore asked me, how can I prove that I am not a Nazi? It's quite an interesting story and quite an interesting question. I thought about it and I said, maybe there's a solution. Horst, you have archives, papers that have been handed down to you by your mother, 10,000 pages from 1929 to 49. Why don't you give these archives to a museum, and they will then be able to see what it is your mother and your father did to the Jewish population. Horst said, that's a magnificent idea. So I established contact for him with the Holocaust Museum in Washington. Everything was digitized. And then Horst said, well, would you like a copy? And I said, why not? And one day I received a USB key at the end of 2014 with 10,000 hallucinating pages, all of them in German. So I set up a research cell, and the rat line is in fact a story of love shared by Otto and Charlotte. It's a story of lies, all the things that are not spoken, are not said, and it's a story about justice, because Otto escapes in 45, is never found, never caught up with, but dies in unexpected circumstances in Rome in a Vatican hospital. And it was a detective story.
Yes, it does read like a thriller. Perhaps I could, you said this was a personal story for you, Anna. Anya, could you tell us how you discovered that you were Jewish at the age of 33, and you were hidden by your parents, or it was hidden by your parents until then? How did this discovery influence your choice of research subjects? How did you react to it? You said a minute ago that a lot of things were known about how the Jews were treated in Poland. Did this have an effect on you in your subsequent research? I think that my own answers to this question change over time. When I found out I was Jewish, I was very excited. I had my address book. We still had paper address books, and I rang everybody from A to Z saying, I'm Jewish, I'm Jewish. I've always been obsessed by the relationships between the Poles and the Jews, and I'm a psychotherapist by training. I was in a group of Poles and Jews, and it's always been an issue I've been interested in. I always felt like the Polish woman, and my nightmare was what we'd done to the Jews, and then all of a sudden I found myself on the other side. So it's important for me. When I think of myself as Jewish. And at the beginning, we had a Holocaust Research Center in Poland, but now there are a lot of people working on it. And I was filled with gratitude. These people didn't have to do this research, but they decided to. Then I realized that all my friends who were working on these issues were not Jewish, or most of them anyway. And I asked myself, is there something that separates us? Is the work we're doing different? And I think the answer is no. They're doing the same work on remembrance and grief that I am. So yes, I would say that it's very important for me. Philippe Sands talked about his work with the archives. I think that you went through a huge number of archives in many different places. This is a literary festival. We're talking about writing. So perhaps we could spend a minute talking about how you transform a huge body of material, very rich material, into a book full of clear information, which has a clear structure and comes to a logical end. That seems to me to be a daunting task. How do you organize it? How do you select the information you're going to use from amongst all your sources, and how do you turn it into a sentence that becomes a chapter that becomes a book? The first version of my book had chapters, and each chapter was a distinct story. And a friend of mine read it and said, there is too much of your own emotion in this book. So I completely revisited the book. Now it's half made up of my own journal, and the other half is people's stories, testimony. So it covers my work, my investigation, and I'm outside the stories that are now told by the people themselves, because it is very emotional for me. And in Philippe's work, he talks about his grandfather. And he's talking about his family, and it's only logical that he would be emotional about that. But I'm talking about people that I have and have never had any personal relationship with. But my emotions for them were very strong. I became friends with people during my work on the book, and for a time I was sort of a member of the community of Jedwabne. So I put all of this into the journal, and that was my outlet. That's how I dealt with the book. This is a structure you're familiar with, because in the rat line, you go back and forth between historical research, mainly based on the correspondence between Charlotte and her husband, and from time to time you come back to your modern day relationship with Horst and how the investigation is going on. So this is a structural similarity between your books, and I think that's very important, because delving into the past is also a way of gaining insight into the present and understanding it and grasping it. In your personal work, I mean, you can talk about the archives if you want, but we don't have time to go into all of them. Is the work for you something that should be of use in the present?
For the rat line, there are three main characters. I play a role, but there is the son, Horst, the father, Otto. But for me, the main character is the mother, is Charlotte. Why? Because in all these stories, and I think it's probably the same thing in your book, Anna, in all these stories, it is always the men who seem to occupy center place. But these men are married, they have lovers, they have girlfriends, and I always wondered what sort of relationships existed between men and women in that kind of situation. The very interesting thing in the archives I was given were the personal letters. Those were the most interesting things. The letters written by Charlotte. She's a wife, she's a mother, she helps her husband. In fact, she plays a key role. An example. When we start looking at how we select documents to make a book, I read everything I find, then I wait for some time, and then I think where were or when were the key moments. For example, 15 March 1938, Adolf Hitler arrives in Vienna for the first time after the Anschluss. He stands at the balcony, hundreds and thousands of people at his feet, and Charlotte writes in her letters, I was standing there a meter away from the Führer, showing that they were really top-table Nazis. What happens after that? Hitler leaves, Charlotte and Otto go into the Hofburg Palace, walk down the main marble staircase, and at the foot of the staircase, Otto turns to his wife, Charlotte, and says, "Darling, I have a decision to make. I can continue my career as a lawyer and make lots of money, or I can accept the invitation which was extended to us, to me, by Mr. Seyss-Inquart, the new governor, and join the government as Secretary of State." And she said, Secretary of State. That was a turning point, a decisive point for the family, not only for Otto and Charlotte, but for their 6 children. 6 children who were going to have together 23 children. All these people were impacted by that very moment. If Charlotte had said, no, continue to work as a lawyer, don't go in for that suggestion, all the dramatic consequences for their children and grandchildren would not have existed, would not have come about. 70 years later, I'm in the following situation. I'm in Vienna. Quite by chance, one of the grandchildren of Otto and Charlotte married one of my students. Remarkable coincidence. And she invites me to have dinner with her in a restaurant in Vienna. We're sitting there together. Her husband, Otto and Charlotte's grandson, gets up and goes somewhere, I don't know where. She turns to me and says, Philippe, I have a question to put to you. She said, sure. I say, sure. And she says, I would simply like to ask you not to publish your book in Austria. And I said, why? And I said, well, because it is going to destroy the life of our child. We don't talk about all these things in our family. We want the Wächter name to be clean. If you publish your book, if you show your film in Austria, it will be dramatic for us. So in answer to your question, the past has an impact on today. And your Bush is published in Austria, yes, this very week, in fact. It's coming out this week. And the first review was published in the Standard, 2 full pages yesterday. Very positive. And we'll see what comes of it. I was meant to be in Austria next week, but because of the coronavirus, it will only be in April. So silence doesn't only prevail in Poland or in Austria. In fact, we're experiencing that just now in England, not around the Holocaust, but around slavery, racism, colonialism, and it is exactly the same thing. People just don't want to talk about those things. They don't want to open the door a crack. And what I discovered with Otto and with this book, which is going to be published in the Netherlands also in April, is that these things are universal. Every community has had atrocities, has experienced atrocities. Ireland, for example, the Catholic Church and sexual abuse of young children. Until 5 years ago, nobody wanted to speak about this. So I think silence is a universal theme. Silence not only in the political field, but also within families. In fact, everything starts within families. Yes.
I also think that the family unit is what keeps everything that happened alive. And this is what I talk about in the book on Jedwabne. The families were the depositories of this total lie. And Jedwabne, when I started to write my book, the massacre had taken place 60 years before. So we were already on the second and third generation of descendants. Then I read a book called The Grandchildren, written by a Turkish author. It happened in little villages, and it was the same as Jedwabne. The families of the murderers in the village were playing a central role. We're talking about Armenian families, Jewish families, Tutsi families. All of these families have no voice in the community still after all these years. A book that was published for the 100th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide. So it happened 100 years later, Jedwabne 60 years later. And I was at a seminar with Philippe Sands, who wrote a book, and he was working on his new book, which is about Rwanda 20 years on. And it's the same thing. The communities in Jedwabne, Rwanda, and Turkey are basically the same communities where the same phenomenon happened. Families have the memory, but they condemn everyone to silence.
Not only lies, because I was on the other side of the fence. I lived as a child in silence with my grandfather. He never wanted to talk about all this, but it wasn't a matter of lies that had to be hidden. It was a matter of protection and also shame. The shame of having survived, of having been one of the only ones of his family to have survived. Silence in families exists for very different reasons.
Yes, that's true. And it's a very interesting problem, the problem of the responsibility of the descendants of the family. In other words, is Horst responsible for what his father did?
No, Horst is not responsible for what his father did, but Horst has another responsibility, looking at facts clearly in the face. But the major drama of this book, you will find them in the very last pages of the book, what the granddaughter says. My grandfather is a mass murderer, she says. And because of those few words, the family is now living something dramatic because the book is published. I have been in contact with the son, but also the granddaughter and Magdalena. The one who wears a turban, is that right? Yes. Well, I have to be careful here. It's quite complicated. Magdalena converted to Islam, and she explained to me that that was for her the only way of getting away from her family, of putting some distance between herself and the rest of her family. I understand that and I respect it, but you can imagine that in Austria today, for most people, what is even worse than becoming Jewish is converting to Islam. This is something I have experienced. Last year, Magdalena and I spent 3 days, three remarkable days traveling the roads which Otto followed when he went from Austria to Italy. We followed the route he followed. And when you walk along in Austria with a woman who is veiled, you can feel very obviously what it means to be a member of the Islamic community in Austria. I was really shocked as I walked along with her, veiled as she was. Everybody looks at you. So family questions will always be there. And now there's the question of the great-grandson, the son of Magdalena. I tried to convince him with Horst that his great-grandfather was a decent person.
So converting to Islam is probably interesting for you as a psychologist. There's a whole process of identification with victims at work there. But now that we've talked about the very colorful character from the rat line, I'd also like to talk about the characters that we find in your work, Anya Bikont. Many of them have passed away, many of those who testified for you. But they were also the ones who really made this book possible. We've talked a lot about remembrance and other abstract concepts, but there are survivors and direct sources, eyewitnesses. Could you tell us a bit about these people? Maybe I'll pick one person with whom I was in contact just once, because there are many characters that I'm very attached to in my book. But this is another family story. It's to do with the sons of the families of the murderers. So János Zet is a character in my book. And when I often went to Jedwabne, and I would meet him in the street or in a meeting organized by the priest, and he would always shout at me. He'd shout, "You hate the Polish people." But he would also say, "But do you know what happened?" Because I asked my mother, and she wouldn't tell me. And he knew, and I knew that he was one of the sons of one of those who'd been on trial. I gave him my telephone number, and he rang me to say he wanted to study the Talmud. I didn't know how to go about that. I didn't really know how to help him, but I found out. And I told him it's 64 volumes. There's a library in Poland where you can find it. There are some volumes in English. You can get those as well. Only 4 volumes in English, I said, but there are 64 other volumes that haven't been translated. And he said, "Yes, I know. The Jews are always hiding information." So we had these strange conversations. And then he rang me again, and he said, "Do you have the minutes from the trial?" I said, "Yes." And he said, "Can you send them to me? I want to see what they say about my father." So I did. This happened about 20 20 years ago, nearly 20 years ago. And once I sent the minutes of the trials to him, I had no more contact with him. But the day before I was going to come here, this year, he contacted me again, and he said he doesn't live in Jedwabne. He has a small agricultural business, and he said he bought something on Allegro, which is like Amazon, and he always looks around to see what they have for sale. And on their site, he saw a matzeva, which is a tombstone that for the Jewish cemetery. What it said on the site was not that it was that it was a tombstone. It said that it was for sharpening knives, because during the war, the Poles and the Germans, but now I'm only talking about the Poles desecrated the Jewish cemeteries, and they would take the matzeva and make them into a wheel. They weren't granite. They were some kind of softer stone, which was cheaper. They would put a hole in the middle, put a rope through it, and create a mechanism for sharpening knives. Not kitchen knives, but the kind you use if you're a farmer. And so he bought the matzeva, and he said, what do I do with it now? What am I supposed to do with it? And I said, well, you have to see whether there's still a Jewish cemetery somewhere, find the person who the matzeva belongs to, and go and put it back on his or her tomb. So he sent me a photograph, and all it says, because we should have the name in Hebrew on it, and then a phrase such as, may he rest in peace, may his soul rest in peace, or something like that. And that part has been cut off, and all it says is his soul. And we don't know whose tombstone it is, and we don't know where to put it. So he gave it to me. I've got the matzeva at home, the matzeva coming from the son of a murderer that was sold as a knife sharpening stone.
Oui, absolument.
So it's fascinating to learn so many years later that this is continuing. There's a character in the rat line who's similar.
Otto Wächter, as you will remember, flees in 1945, and he disappears completely. And through the family archive in 2015, for the very first time, I discover this story. On the 9th of May, 45, he met a young Waffen-SS soldier who was in Italy and in Yugoslavia, where he killed the partisans, the communists, by the hundreds. His name was Burkhard Hartmann. He knew how to survive in the mountains above 2,000 meters altitude, where it is cold more or less all year round. So he took Otto Wächter above 2,000 meters, and that's where they lived for 3 years. Every 2 weeks, Charlotte would come up with newspapers, clothes, food, boots, and all sorts of things. All this is in the archives. So I put the question in 2016 to Horst. I asked, how was Bukko Hartmann? Why did he do what he did? Did he stay in contact with the family afterwards? And Horst looks at me and says, well, Philip, you're asking me all these questions. I could answer all the questions, but we could also phone him, which we did. And several weeks later, we met him. I met someone who was 94, a man who had never talked to anybody of what had happened at that time. His only condition to meeting me was that I should not put questions about what had happened before the 9th of May, 1945, because he's afraid he will be arrested for what he did in Italy and ex-Yugoslavia in 43 and 44. So he told me stories about the period 45 to 48. 70 years after the events, he really felt he had to talk about this. And I mentioned this when I was in Nuremberg a few days ago. Being in the presence of someone who was following the Nuremberg trial, but from the mountains, was extraordinary. In fact, Charlotte was told, I need the newspapers for two reasons: get the football results and knowing what is happening to Frank, Baldur von Schirach, Kaltenbrunner, Seyss-Inquart at the Nuremberg trials. I put the question about how Wächter reacted to the fact they were all hung. Well, he was furious, very disappointed, and he was very afraid. So talking to someone who was a direct actor in that period was really amazing. He died in the meantime, but he felt like talking. Yes, he felt like talking, but also being silent, because he only wanted to talk about a certain period and not about the crimes he committed in earlier years. So he is burying some information, revealing other information. And in both cases, one sees, I think, how important it is for some people to feel worthy. You keep to lies, provided you can remain dignified. Well, for Horst, lying about what his father did or denying it is the only way for him to survive. When we shot the film with David Evans, we were very afraid we might trigger off all sorts of events. I have two friends, a psychiatrist and a psychoanalyst. I turned to them and I said, I'm very afraid of what might happen with this film. What do you advise me to do? Both of them helped us and insisted that we be extremely careful, explaining that for Horst, the story is not so much the story of his relationship to his father, but rather to his mother. The mother loved the father, had built a whole system of remembrance of the father, hoping that the 6 children would feel good about their father. And these two friends of mine explained to me that the important thing here was not so much the relationship between the son and the father, but more the relationship between the son and the mother.
We can add that wasn't there something about him having dinner twice, once with his mother and once with his wife, once with his mother and once with his wife?
Meurt le 16 juillet 49.
Otto Wächter died in 49 in the Santo Spiritu Hospital, the Vatican Hospital in Rome. He was buried on the 16th, having died on the 13th. 10 years later, the bishop, a very notorious bishop, Austrian, contacts Charlotte. In fact, they come from a major Polish family, yes, and that bishop contacts Mrs. Wächter and tells her, Mrs. Wächter, I forgot to tell you that when your husband died, his last wish was to be buried in Austria. Why don't you come and fetch him? All this is written in the papers I've been given. You can really hear Charlotte because she recorded some of her memories. So she takes the car, she goes to Rome, asks for a special authorization to take her husband's body back to Austria. The Italian authorities said no, but you can move him within the bounds of Italy. She has a niece in Sicily. She decides to say she will be taking him to Sicily. She gets her son-in-law to come and fetch this box without telling the son-in-law what is in the box. And then what do I find in the archives? A little after that, in 1960, newspaper articles saying Interpol is looking for the body of former Nazi von Wächter. And I asked to Horst and say, what happened there? He smiled and said, well, mother brought him back home. What does that mean? I asked. And he said, well, she took him home and buried him in the garden in the small house we used to live in, where we used to have as lodgers American and English students. I have at least a dozen letters of these students who wrote, having read the book, saying we never knew Charlotte was a confirmed Nazi, nor of the fact that her husband was buried in the garden in which we played.
Charlotte was very happy to tell the American soldiers who arrived in Austria that she was a good Nazi, a happy Nazi.
Natürlich, she says, when you ask whether she is a Nazi. Yes, of course I am. We're laughing about this, but it isn't an amusing story. There's another moment where our situations meet. In December 1939, you find a letter from Otto to Charlotte. He's in Krakow. He has just been appointed governor in Krakow, and he writes to his wife and says, everything's marvelous here. The Vienna Phil came, beautiful performance. German ministers came from Berlin. Everything's extraordinary. Just a few problems with the Poles. Tomorrow I have to shoot 50 Poles. He didn't say where or how. And that is where, with one of my Polish students, I started doing a bit of research work. And in the archives in Warsaw, we found everything. This was something that happened in Bochnia, a city. And in fact, these were the very first reprisals in Poland carried out on the orders of Hitler. 25 Poles for each German that had been killed. We also found a reference to a photographer who was apparently present at the time. It took us 2 years to find those pictures. We were able to show that Wächter was present when those Poles were shot. The pictures are in my book, terrible pictures. When I showed those pictures to Horst, he looked at them and he said, doesn't prove anything, does it? When I show those pictures to Horst's daughter, that's where she realized that there was evidence, black and white evidence, that she had to turn her back on her father, on her family, and that's where she turned away from them. It was really a very powerful moment. It happened in a restaurant, and it was very dramatic.
I'd like to come back to this story of the tombstone, which is, I think, important. It reminds us of what you say in the book about the two realities in Poland today. Can you tell us about these two realities that I think are important? And I'd like to link that up with another episode in your book, which we'll talk about later, which is your visit to Ukraine, to the commemorations carried out by the neo-Nazis, the new Nazis. But can you tell us about the two realities in Poland? And the anecdote that you mentioned earlier is part of that conflict between reparation and forgetfulness. Yes, well, in Poland, on the one hand, we have some excellent researchers and excellent studies that tell us what happened during the Holocaust. There are really a great many books, and this is the best of what Polish history has to give us right now, this investigative research. And on the other hand, we have a negation of history which is nearly total. People say, well, there may have been little incidents, but we have to, we have a right-wing government in Poland, and we have to stop with this guilt and shame, and we have to teach people, we have to replace this attitude with an attitude of worthiness and pride, national pride. So that's the new official version. We should be proud. There's always been a specific issue in Poland which has to do with victimization. The times when we were victims are our favorite times in history. So if the Jews can be even more victimized, that's good. It makes it easier to bear. If you ask the Poles who suffered most during the Holocaust, they'll say it was the Poles, which is pretty incredible when you think about it. And it's not because they don't learn about the Holocaust in school. And now everything hinges on people who were victims in Poland during the war, after the war, due to communist repression. For the right in Poland, Jews and communists are all the same thing. Communist repression after the war for them is Jewish repression after the war, so there's a very deep and strong current in favor of contradicting truth that comes out. Could you just tell us a bit about how your actual visits to Jedwabne, how were you received there, and how did your work unfold? Well, usually I would knock on doors and people would slam them in my face. And I did knock on every door that was available to me. So this was hard for me. I was a reporter, and I was also an interviewer, and I think that it's one of my really good skills. I have good questions to ask, and I know how to do it, and I understood that in Jedwabne, the best thing was not to ask any question. The only good question was no question. So what I could do is listen to people, say, oh, yesterday I went to a meeting with the priest. Did you hear what he said? I've got notes. I can tell you what happened if you want, or talk about the trial and say I have the trial minutes. If you're interested, I can read them to you. So I would get little crumbs out of this. People would say, well, of course, the Poles didn't kill the Jews. Mordechai raped some Jewish girls, but he also raped his own daughters. So these little crumbs helped me to retrace and rebuild the story. And what's fantastic in our work, I'm not talking about our writing, but in our way of working, and I like this very much, is that we're working from the archives, but we're also meeting people. And we can't understand what's in the archives unless we talk to people. And the conversations remain quite superficial if we don't know what's in the archives. So the blending of the two makes the work really fascinating. I think, personally, anyway, it's certainly the case for me. Philippe Sands, when you went to the Ukraine with Horst, his reaction was quite striking, because you say that he's not a Nazi, he's not an anti-Semite, but these people in Ukraine who admire his father, he really likes that. He's proud to pose next to their cars. And in your film, we also see how proud he is. So how do you put that together with what's happening today and the rise of populism and extreme patriotism in other parts of Europe?
In 2014, Niklas Frank, Horst Wächter, and I decided to travel together to Ukraine, to go near Lvov and Zhulkiev. Zhulkiev, the village of my family and Herr Lauterbach's family as well. Horst is the one who said that he would be ready to go to Ukraine, but at a certain date in July, because that is when there is a commemoration of the Waffen-SS division called Galicia, which his father set up in 1943. So we spent a day there, and we met many Ukrainians dressed in Nazi uniforms, and they were 100% Nazis, proud of being 100% Nazi. They kept saying, when the Nazis came here, it was perfect for us. There were 3 communities in our village, the Poles on the top, the Jews in the middle, and we were way down at the bottom. All of a sudden, the Jews were exterminated. The Poles left, returned to go to Poland, and we became the masters of the land. So for us, Otto Wächter is a great man. Of course, this is not a majority. It's a minority and a small minority at that, but a minority which nevertheless has some power and major impact on the political life of the country. 2 days ago at Nuremberg, when the Minister for Foreign Affairs said a few words, he mentioned the rise of Nazism in certain countries. And it was clear he was talking about Poland and Ukraine. He was using certain pictures, and it makes me just a little nervous because I'm the one who perhaps opened those doors. It's very complicated. In Poland, when the Germans came, there weren't thousands of them, but perhaps a dozen in each village in Zhulkiev, where the whole Jewish population was killed in a single day. On the 25th of March 1943, 3,500 Jews were killed on that day. It wasn't the German soldiers who did that, but the auxiliary Ukrainian forces. And in Zhulkiev, when we wanted to discuss this, they didn't want to talk about it because they knew we were going to talk about their fathers and their grandfathers who were implied in what happened on the 25th of March 1943. All this now has landed on my doorstep again. Next year, in September, will be celebrated the 80th anniversary of the Babi Yar murders. There will be a major event organized in Kiev, a commemoration of that day. They contacted me and asked me whether I would be ready to participate and make a keynote speech. I spoke to friends, people I can speak with very frankly. I said, if I come, I have to speak very openly because there are a lot of Ukrainians who were implied, who played key roles in what happened at Babi Yar. Without the Ukrainians, the Germans would never have been able to kill so many people over so few days. So we'll see. We'll see if they confirm the invitation, but it is in fact exactly the same phenomenon as the one you described, except that they are perhaps lagging behind by a quarter of a century in respect to what you have achieved in Poland. Yes, perhaps they're lagging behind, but there's another situation. Collaborating with the Germans in Poland was collaboration, whereas for the Ukrainians it was a chance to seize in a way. It was a hopeful thing to do. Yes, indeed. There are differences, but doors will remain closed in both cases, I think.
I don't think we're going to ever exhaust your books or even the subject in this hour-long session, which is coming to an end. And yeah, Bikont, you've been in a writing residency here at the Fondation Jan Michalski for 3 months. In just a few words, how is what's happening in Polish society now in recent weeks and months? How do you feel about your return to Poland? What is your feeling about what's happening? And, well, there's a new generation of Polish people, men and women, who have taken to the streets. They don't want anything to do with the current government, with the current Polish climate. They're brave. They're funny. They know that they want a democratic Poland that can be closer to the European Union, a normal country, not a country of backward Catholicism. So I have great hope. I thought that the entire world was going in the wrong direction, and now, with the election of Biden and the protests in the streets in Poland and the vaccine against the coronavirus, I think the wind has turned, and I really hope so. Thank you very much. Thank you for ending on an optimistic note. Philippe Sands, would you like to say one last thing? No, I feel exactly the same feeling of hope. We've had a few problems in the UK with a fairly catastrophic government, and the transition from Donald Trump to Joe Biden, we can already feel the change coming. For example, I'm almost 100% sure, I already thought, but I'm almost 100% sure that the EU and the UK are going to reach an agreement this coming week, because the British can no longer count on Donald Trump for support. Mr. Biden is going to be much more keen on the rule of law, the EU, and law in international relations. So it is a time of hope. I totally agree with you. Thank you very much, Philippe Sands. The Rat Line was published in September, Albin Michel. The Crime and the Silence was published in 2011 in French. We French readers are really waiting for the rest of your work to be published in French, and I wouldn't want to sign off before thanking our 2 interpreters who are giving access to a broader audience. And thank you to everyone who's listening, and thank you to the Fondation Jan Michalski for organizing this festival. Thank you very much.